Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Foreign Policy. I'm your guest host, Behnam Taleblu here, Senior Director of the Iran Program at the FDD think tank in DC. I'm thrilled today to be joined by the one and only Dr. Ali Ansari, a friend and someone whose work on Iranian history I've looked up to for many years. He is a professor of history at St. Andrews University in Scotland, and he also leads the Iranian Studies program there. Dr. Ansari, thank you for your time today.
It's very good to be with you, Behnam, and I'm hoping the date isn't relevant, but we're sitting here on Halloween talking about Iran, but there you are.
Absolutely. You're the author of many books on Iran, most recently Iran. My favorite one, of course, for the audience is The History of Nationalism in Modern Iran.
Yeah,
but let's get right into it.
Yeah.
There is a rising sense of nationalism in Iran. What do you ascribe that to? Is that just, the Islamic Republic pushing people in a certain direction and people rebelling against it, or is this something ingrained in Iranians?
I think the point you make is a good one, because I think in one sense it's a reaction to the rampant Islamism that the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution in that sense has sought to impose on Iranians. So there's a reaction to that, which you see is sort of in contradiction to what you see perhaps in the rest of the Middle East. The Iranians have lived under a sort of an Islamist government, and they obviously have reacted quite heavily towards that. But I don't think you can ignore the fact that actually leaders in the Islamic Republic itself have also embraced nationalism to an extent. Probably more cynically than in previous occasions. Some of them are clearly, genuinely have a great affection for the country, but the senior leadership of the country, even Khamenei and others, have also sought to harness nationalism to their own ends. So one of the curiosities about it is that they've, in a sense, nationalism is on the rise. Not only because of a social reaction against the oppression, really, of the Islamic Republic, but also because the leadership of the Islamic Republic has found some use for it. And of course, this has become a problem for them. And I see this also in terms of the in a sense the affectation, shall we say, that you see for pre-Islamic monarchy and other things in Iran, even in the post-12-day war, where you've seen it really being boosted to an extraordinary level among the regime establishment. And this is for them an attempt to sort of establish legitimacy. I don't think it particularly works, but it shows also what gains traction in Iran, what appeals to Iran. I mean, one of the striking things I said to people were saying to me, look at this nationalism in Iran post the 12-day war. And I said, well, one of the striking things about it is that, the Islamic Republic hits a crisis, a very serious crisis. And who does it appeal to? It doesn't appeal to the sort of the figures of Islamic history. It appeals to Shahpur and Khosrow and Dariush and Kurosh and all these people. This is a monarchical history, a secular history, a monarchical history, and one that I think in the pre-revolutionary establishment and certainly the last Shah would have been very proud of.
To that end, let me push you a little bit, because I have a slightly different take about the utility of nationalism for Iran's leaders. There's a real glass ceiling, or even a stone ceiling, that the more they try to gain legitimacy here, they lose legitimacy elsewhere. It is very zero-sum when, to paraphrase Khomeini, he's saying patriotism or nationalism is paganism, and he's mocking early, nationalist figures, particularly in the National Front, who helped make his revolution possible. But this isn't the first time the Islamic Republic has tried to instrumentalize nationalism.
Not at all.
You've done a lot of great writing on the Ahmadinejad period. I remember an image that would shock any genuine Iranian nationalist or any genuine Iranian Islamist, which was, I think, Ahmadinejad or his chief of staff putting a keffiyeh on a soldier who was dressed like Cyrus the Great. So how has
it was Ahmadinejad?
It was Ahmadinejad.
So Ahmadinejad basically.
How have they instrumentalized it in the past? And
basically, if you look at it, the Islamic Republic started to appeal to nationalism during the Iran-Iraq War. I mean, they realized they had to. I mean, they didn't have much choice. And then, during the Rafsanjani period, I think Rafsanjani was the first person to visit Persepolis. And of course, in those days, you visit Persepolis obviously to gain the deep moral lesson of, what happens when you become decadent. And I remember very vividly.
Also, I don't think Maxime's of Paris is what it used to be.
No. but they, not from the 1971 celebrations. But he basically, I remember there was a sign, when I went to visit Persepolis, I think, back in the 1990s, early 1990s. And there was a sign there, and they took some sort of, I think it was a Quranic verse about, this is what happens when hubris and decadence, civilizations, all this sort of stuff. So there was a sort of moral lesson. But the fact that Rafsanjani had gone and visited made it all very legitimate again. They said, okay, we can go and visit and maybe we can learn the moral case. And then, of course, you have to understand that in the later 1990s, the Islamic Republic found no problem at all in utilizing the myths of the Shahnameh, for instance. I mean, for them, the Shahnameh was part of sort of Persian culture, and they were going to use it. And of course, it appealed to them. I mean, in the sense that the core people of the leadership of the Islamic Republic were obviously very Muslim and Islamist in their outlook, but they sort of viewed that a way of keeping other people happy was to sort of broaden the concentric circles of loyalty, and therefore you could appeal to nationalism in one way or form. And of course, under Khatami, it became much more legitimate, much more acceptable. And I remember very vividly talking to in fact, a former cleric, I think it was at the time, and he had a poster of the tomb of Cyrus in the oven. And I said, this is very interesting to see this. And he looked at me and he said, "There you see a religious man." And I went, "Religious? I mean, in what?" He said, Cyrus was a very religious man. And of course, what he was talking about was in a biblical sense, right? I mean,
the Messiah, literally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. so you sort of thought, okay, you're sort of marrying and merging in these different narratives. Very common theme actually in Iranian history. If you see that in the post-Islamic conquest of the 7th century, a lot of Iranian historians would marry these two different narratives: the kings of Persia, Iran, and the sort of the prophetic tradition of the Muslim, the Abrahamic faiths. So that was what was going on. But you're quite right. It's Ahmadinejad who sort of, dials up the level to 11, if I can put it that way, and really gets a bit carried away with it. And then, of course, it's not only that he negotiates for the Cyrus cylinder to come back to Iran for the first time since 1971, and it's a very emotive thing, and it's there for 10 months. 2 million people go to see it. It's like the Holy Grail in Iran, the Cyrus cylinder. And of course, lest we forget, the British have it. So obviously there's it's even more powerful.
I've only made the pilgrimage to the British Museum in London to see it.
And, there's a lot of thing about how, this is an Iranian thing. Of course, it was actually found in Babylon and Iraq, but there you are. And
was it made worse by Gertrude Bell finding it or something?
I don't know, he built up on this. But of course, in the other interview, I don't know if you saw the other picture where, in 2007, Putin come when his first time as president, he came to visit Iran, and Ahmadinejad wanted to take him to Persepolis, and they said, no, you can't do this. It looks a little bit like the previous Shah. So what they did is they built this sort of papier-mâché sort of frieze of Persepolis, and they had Putin and Ahmadinejad walk past it, and of all the guards, guards of Javedan and all this one. I mean, the whole thing was sort of frankly absurd, but this is what Ahmadinejad was cultivating, and he was very keen on doing. So again, I mean, they do. I think they have some of them believe in it. Clearly, I think Ahmadinejad was very taken by it. I mean, this is the point. I mean, Persian history, Iranian history has a very seductive quality, and people were willing to buy into it if they could. But I tend to agree with you that there's an awkwardness with the Islamic Republic to be appealing to this sort of stuff. I mean, it's and the way they tried to do it was basically to turn Cyrus, believe it or not, Kourosh, into a Muslim. I mean, how the hell do you do that? But there's this sort of idea, and I wrote an article on this where they have a wonderful newspaper, and they say, Kourosh Bunyad Gozar Tawheed or something. I mean, basically
founder of monotheism,
which is on many different levels complete nonsense. But there you are. You want to try and sort of promote it, and this is a way of sort of basically trying to sort of merge these narratives and making them accessible. The interesting thing is the person who said this is actually that was the head of the Iranian Studies Institute in Iran at the time, some sort of Bunyad Iran Shinasi, the foundation for the study of Iran. And who was it? It's the brother of Khamenei. I mean, this is absurd.
Hadi?
No, not Hadi. No, Hadi is very much out of favor all the time. It was another one, another of the brothers. And I found that very striking. I mean, what the hell is going on, And this is why I mean that when you look at nationalism in Iran, what the Islamic Republic has done, the leadership, I should say, is they flirted with it, I think is the best way to do it. They sort of think, we can use this. It binds people together. It affords a bit of legitimacy, particularly when people are becoming less and less
religious,
fixed on religion, and certainly the official religion. And, this is what we try and do. But I agree with you entirely that I think in many ways it's highly cynical. Nationalism in Iran is something that needs to be looked at, or let's put it this way, nationalism among Iranians needs to be looked at a lot more intensely, a lot more diligently, because I think, I've increasingly come to the view that and this is a view, by the way, that the early ideologues understood, Furughi, Taqizad and others, that nationalism is a broad spectrum of ideas, right? I mean, it's not just a singular idea. And there are, under the Shah, they used to talk about negative and positive nationalism, and but I tend these days, I find it, because it's a convenient analytical tool. I mean, that's all I will say. What Orwell distinguishes between patriotism and nationalism, and he thinks patriotism is the positive end, and nationalism in its vulgar sense, and is the negative end. And I think, what's happening, certainly with the leadership of the Islamic Republic, what you're seeing is nationalism on a very vulgar level, which is very bombastic. It's grandiose. It's all about, how many bombs we can build, how powerful we are. But it doesn't seem to have a huge amount of concern for the welfare of Iranians themselves.
Yeah, there's very little interest paid to the nation.
That's it. And I've written this somewhere, and I think you're absolutely right again, that what we have in Iran is Iranian nationalism without the Iranians. And this is the tragedy. But you see this very widespread among the wider, people. They get very fixated on the nation as an abstract, but they don't see the people that constitute that nation. So I find that, I find that both interesting in terms of a discussion. I think I think Iranians themselves find it quite difficult to deal with in some ways, because they don't like to, nationalism is almost like a belief among Iranians. I mean, it's a credo, and it's very difficult to challenge that credo without people becoming very sort of sensitive about it. But I do think that if we're serious about the future in Iran, we have to think about these things in a much, much more mature way. And, I'm always struck that many people in the diaspora, for instance,
You mentioned the D word.
Yes, but many people in the diaspora, in the comfort of the West. I wrote about this actually on my, I'm going to do a shameless plug here, ladies and gentlemen, on my Substack. But I wrote about this there, where I talk about, this sort of idea that there are many intensely bombastic and nationalistic Iran, in terms of support for the Islamic Republic, by the way, right? But they live in Washington and New York and London, and they talk in very grandiose ways about Iranian might and power, and let's hit it to the West. And actually, you talk to Iranians in Iran, and that's exactly what they don't want. What they want is just a normal life. They want to be proud of their country. Of course they do. But they also want to be able to travel. They want to be able to,
they want dignity. They want a different D.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That's a different D. I like that.
Let me just impress upon one thing with the diaspora, and then move to one other area where nationalism can be a shiv, because I want to stick with this theme.
Okay.
With the diaspora, you mentioned people as well as the country. I have experienced this maybe in more limited circles, but I will say in Canada, in the UK, in France, in Australia, in New Zealand, places where I've seen different elements of the Iranian diaspora, different levels of connectivity to the local politics in each of their countries. But when they talk about Iranian nationalism, or when they frame themselves as Iranian nationalists, do you find that it kind of correlates with the left-right debate in each of their countries? I'll tell you what I mean by that.
Okay, yeah, give me an example.
For most of the Iranian diaspora that I've met on the left in these places, the nationalism is about the people.
Yeah.
For most of the Iranian diaspora on the right, it is about the land. And I feel like this divorce that no one even negotiated between these two philosophies needs to be done with if nationalism is going to be channeled properly by a demos, by a population in the future of a fundamentally different kind of Iran that can actually vote. I have no problem with governments instrumentalizing ideologies. I mean, that's to have politics be exactly to have politics be cynical is to fundamentally understand politics, right? But to actually have it be in the service of something greater than themselves, that is what we haven't had in Iran. So do you think it's possible to actually fuse these different kind of kaleidoscopic visions of nationalism, of fundamentally just serving the people, or fundamentally just kind of heaping praise on the nation?
I think you do. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the left-right divide, by the way, because I think there are many people on the left also who also have this rather bizarre notion of, the sort of communal spirit that, sometimes taken to a sort of an extreme end, that that sort of ignores the actual constituent parts, the people. So the left-right divide is not one that necessarily categorically works. But I take your point, and I would fundamentally agree with you that what needs to happen is a much more interesting discussion about what it all means, so that you do have, in a sense, something that understands that fundamentally nationalism is about people. It's not just about land. It's not just about, one thing or another. It's about, the people and in the land, if you can put it that way. And there is some sort of connection, but it's also about building, Tarizade has always very famously said, and I quoted him, so that the real foundations of patriotism cannot be imposed. Yeah. That in order for patriotism, or what he calls, real nationalism, which is basically what he means by patriotism. He talks about Vatan Parasti and sort of, it cannot exist in the absence of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so what you need is a political atmosphere of liberty, effectively, in order for that to flourish. And what he's basically saying is that nationalism comes from the ground up. It doesn't come from the top down. One of the great failings we've had, I think, in the 20th, but there are reasons for it. I'm not saying you can explain it, because of course modernization, whatever, in Iran in the 20th century did come from the top down.
Centralization, homogenization.
Yeah, exactly. It did come from the top down. But I think, what we have done in Iran in the 20th century, and this goes back to the short book that I was trying to summarize this in, is that we have built the state. And the state we see today, by the way, is the Pahlavi state, by the way. I mean, you have to, the Islamic Republic has never really built anything. It's inherited it, right? It's added bits and pieces. It's made it work less efficiently, but, and basically run it down. But, that state that we have today is basically the state that Reza Shah and his supporters built in the 1920s and 30s. And we have that. But what we haven't really matched it with is the sort of development of society, if I can put it that way, the matching it with society, giving people the rights. And if what we need in Iran actually is a proper idea of a social contract. People think, and I used to get this when I used to get, they said, now, the Vatan and, Mihandust and all that. I mean, all these languages, it's all about a relationship with the state that's unconditional. The state can have what it wants from you. Okay. And you don't have any rights of the state, but that doesn't work. Nowhere in the world does that work in a meaningful sense. In a meaningful sense, if you go to the United States, if you go to Western Europe and other places, what you have is you have a relationship. You do, the state gives you things and you give things to the state, and it works as a sort of a symbiotic relationship. And those are the most successful and the most powerful and the strongest states. There is a fallacy that the bigger bombs you have and the more jets you have and the more tanks you have, the more powerful you are. No. It's absolutely not true. I always say to students, if you look at the tax take of many states, look at the Western states, and if your citizens are are paying their taxes in a way that you don't get in the Middle East, but you just don't get it. This shows a fundamentally integrated and I think powerful state. They can raise capital, they raise money, they spend the money, and they spend the money in the interest of the common good. Now,
the debate over the common good.
That's what I mean. I mean, what I'm talking about here are ideal types. Okay, I mean, we know that obviously in the West this is not the case in some ways, and there are frictions, but fundamentally this is the point. And one of my criticisms of the Iranian state as it is today, but this could apply to other essentially non-European or non-Western states, is that they are fundamentally extractive, and they do not exist for the promotion of the welfare of its citizens. Okay, the state exists as a sort of an abstract idea which we all have to worship, and this is the sort of vulgar nationalism that people like Fourouki and others would have derided. They said this is not the purpose. The purpose is that the state exists, and this is very much a sort of a Enlightenment idea, that the state exists in order to serve the people. That's a very American idea. I mean, if you look at it, again, it's an 18th century Enlightenment idea.
But do we have a coherent articulation of a theory of citizenship now? Because this is the trade-off
in Iran.
Yeah. I mean, among civil society or among the diaspora, This is really what is going to make what comes after the Islamic Republic work, because we need to balance.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I mean, I think that there are groups of people and people who work in the politics who this needs to be discussed, outlined, dissected, and worked out. And I think you're absolutely right. I think, interestingly, if you look inside Iran and you look at the political thinking that's going on there, they've probably made more progress on it than many people outside Iran. And probably the reason for that in some ways is because people outside, we live within an environment where we assume certain things. I mean, we assume that we have a sort of citizenship rights. So we've never really had the impetus to think about it. Whereas in Iran, of course, they don't have it. And therefore they constantly are thinking about it. Now, whether it's highly developed or not is another matter. Okay. I mean, I, for instance, during the reform movement in Iran, when I was working very heavily in my first book, of course, was on the whole reform movement and looking at what was going on there, I thought they had made some fairly interesting strides in advance of that. Of course, subsequently to that, the Islamic Republic demolished it all. I mean, they basically deconstructed it all. But it's quite interesting that the memory, in a sense, the
muscle memory,
is there.
Well, what about moving forward now? I am of the belief that not only is nationalism a useful shiv against this kind of a regime with this kind of a rigidity and this kind of an ideology, which even when it...
What do you mean by shiv, by the way?
Shiv, like a knife or some kind of sharp device. And
okay, right.
I don't know. It's a prison.
Is that an American term?
I think it's a prison term. Not that I've been to prison, but as kind of like a knife into the side of this regime. Something that could actually have it bleed out and render it hollow. It can be the bridge to get us to this other thing. I mean, I'll give you an example, which is I've noticed in the West this thing be totally not only ignored, but when paid attention to, derided.
Yeah.
And it's a you could say recently arrived at, or some would more derisively say manufactured holiday, which is the Cyrus Day.
Oh yeah, Cyrus the Great Day. Yeah.
It literally started, I think, a little over a decade ago. Iranians flocking to this site. Again, kind of cognizant, I would call it a national consciousness, a cognizance of their pre-Islamic heritage, but sharply contrasted with the present, deplorable reality. And from there comes the Islamic Republic's cognizance. Rather than try to co-opt it like some of these Shahnameh figures or statues that they're trying to do now after the 12-Day War, they just shut it down. Like in 2016, they started to fine people. 2019 and 2021, I think they blocked it off altogether. This year, again, they blocked it all off. They used the COVID excuse for a little bit of a while. And this has led to Iranians going to, sites where there is poetry, the tombs of their poets instead, to try to use them as nationalist bastions to rally around to kind of contest the Islamic Republic. So as much as I see the need for these things, like a theory of citizenship, I don't think we can get there yet until we do away with the what's left of this regime. How useful is nationalism in bulldozing it rather than it being something that can be co-opted and contested?
Well, I mean, I agree with you in the sense that I think that, you see, so what the Islamic Republic has tried to do is to ride the tiger, and it won't be able to do it. Okay, I mean, it's already failed.
That's a good analogy.
That's it. Yep. So they and the Cyrus the Great thing is a great example, because they say Cyrus, the founder of monotheism, and then suddenly they see crowds going around the tomb of Cyrus the Great, and they go, oh, well, hang on a minute, we don't want these large crowds, let's shut it down. And I think it's very interesting, and I absolutely agree with you. It's a sort of social movement that has sort of developed this. Where I would sort of query is really your idea that what we don't want is a situation where nationalism as an ideology, however which way you want to define it, positive, negative, whatever, manages to push away, the Islamic Republic, so you get a post-Islamic Republic sort of setup. But, what we end up doing is repeating the errors of the past in terms of the social contract, because we haven't thought through properly what should come in its stead. And I think, what we would like to think, I would assume, I'm going to assume this is what you think, Behnam, but
you're welcome
to. What we would like to think is that, when we think of nationalism, what we want is a sort of an enlightened national government that has a sort of a proper relationship with its citizenry, that develops that. But, nationalism in its ugly side doesn't necessarily have to do that. Nationalism in its ugly side could also be quite destructive in its own way. Yes, it may hark on the kings of the past and be a secular movement. But in its own way, it's very ideological and very extreme. I mean, it could be. I'm not saying that's necessarily what will happen, but my point is that I think we should be thinking at the same time, because I entirely agree with you. I mean, to my mind, the ideology of the Islamic Republic is bankrupt anyway. I mean, if at the critical time of crisis you have to call on Shah Paul I to ask Netanyahu to kneel in front of him, whatever. I mean,
it tells you all you need to know.
I mean, yeah. I mean, what this is an overtly, secular, pre-Islamic imagery. That's what you're calling on, and that's what. And if they're putting around this sort of lorry with a video screen of Shah Paul I going around,
driving around.
I mean, there's all sorts of. The other interesting thing there, by the way, and I'm writing about this now, is there's a very interesting interview with the reformist political commentator, come pundit, whatever, Abbas Abdi, and he says in this video, he says that resistance comes in many different ways. And he's talking about the failure of the Islamic Republic to basically deliver on it. But he makes this quite remarkable statement. He says the second most popular boy's name in Iran today is Shahan.
Oh, I heard about that.
Did you see that?
Yeah. I actually have a friend whose brother's son is named Shahan, and that was the first time I heard this, and I checked.
I know, that's what I did. And I sort of said, and I remember people saying, and I said, first of all, I thought, is it Shaheen or is it Shahyan or something? No, it's Shahan, which is not actually it's not in the pre-revolutionary period. I don't know anyone called Shahan.
There was a lot of Rezas and Muhammads and plenty of Alis.
And yet, well, as yours truly. So, I mean, I find that quite striking. I mean, it's an interesting, and he says, it's I don't think he says wonderful, but he says it's a very striking example of civil disobedience, isn't it? Because nobody can tell you what to call your child, I mean, they can.
Although, don't they have, I don't know to what degree they enforce it. There's a series of recommended names that even like embassies around the world, they try to have anyone who
they try to encourage you. They try also to encourage you to have Muhammad Sirus or something like that. So
like
you
hyphenated.
You know what I mean? Yeah, so, and then, you have the name and then you can, but it's,
I guess they're neither Muhammad is happy nor Cyrus.
I know. But again, it's striking where, to my mind, the Islamic Revolution or the Islamic Republic at the moment is going through a period of transition. I mean, people say, oh, the regime hasn't fallen, whatever. Well, sometimes change can happen slowly, and change can happen in subtle ways. And it's not necessarily that, we would, it doesn't necessarily have to be explosive. Now, I tend to be a subscriber of the old Hemingway view, to be honest, that, when he says, how did you go bankrupt? And he says,
slowly,
first very slowly and then very quickly. And I think that's basically, we're at this moment, and I think in the history of the Islamic Republic, where, we are still in the slow phase, but we're basically teetering on the fast phase. Do you know what I mean? It's a question of, as an analyst, I leave that to people like you, Behnam, to sort of work out when precisely this tipping point will be.
That's a very unfair between humanities and the social sciences, an old war between history and political science.
As a historian, I don't predict, but but I can, my own assessment of it is, as a historian, is to say, if you look at the past, the Islamic Republic is basically like any other political system in Iran, like any other dynasty, shall we say, in Iran. It has a lifespan and it's failing, but it's failing more dramatically than previous systems.
How do we, in that sense, speaking as an Iranian American, but living and working in DC, and now I'm going to bring in the other dangerous words, politics and policy. How does one expedite something that is already ordained? You're talking about it having a lifespan. This is kind of natural. How does one expedite that? Because one area I want to push you on is, I actually think if you're looking at the social legitimacy of any regime, which I think is fundamental to any regime or any government's identity and understanding about itself, that has long ago fallen. I think what we're simply waiting for is the commensurate political change to respond to the long-standing social change. I don't think we're still waiting on this slow to all of a sudden. Everything from 99 to present tells me how I, as a first-generation Iranian American, occasionally, still identifies with my Islamic faith, how I am out of touch with large swaths of Iranians today who are on the front line of secular, nationalist, beyond any of these labels. that we in the West try to kind of box them into.
I mean, I think you're right about the social and the political track. So the social track has moved considerably further. The political track is sort of like resisting. It's a bit like a catapult, and it's pulling, and then eventually it'll let go and it will overcome it. And I think.
But those forces that are pulling, is that something endogenous to the regime? Like I, for one, am very weary of all these videos coming out about, the female defiance of hijab, because that is not because of government policy. I actually think that all we're seeing is in spite of government policy. And I feel like this snapshot approach to Middle East politics, where is there a hijab, where isn't there a hijab, is a really improper way to do either humanities work or social science work, because there's really a video here. It's not a series of snapshots.
No, absolutely. And I agree. I mean, your point there is a very good one. It is a video. It's not a snap. I mean, the way that we look at things in terms of almost static pictures is not the right way. But yes, I mean, I think you have to look at it in terms of a process. And I would sort of emphasize the historical approach as better than the social science approach, if I may, because I think the social science approach is a very static one. It likes to look at sort of, key images, I suppose, key moments, whereas actually what we have to do is understand it as a process that's taking place over time.
Well, we think there's indicators and we think there's models, and that models, you can divide. Well, let me push you on this a little bit further.
Models are good, models are good, but we should never be prisoners of our models. That's the problem.
So let's get to those models, because one kind of problem I have with, and I've had the luxury of living and working in DC for less than 2 decades, I think like 18 years, 19 years now, 13 years at this think tank.
No idea you were that old, man.
I'm even older. But to that end, the debate on Iran is still kind of suffocating. And the third rails about, is this going to be another Iraq war? Is this person an apologist? Is this regime change or behavior change? All of those third rails are still there and have really boxed in a proper understanding about Iran. And I fear most policymakers don't see that the social revolution has already happened in Iran. And
I think the trouble with policymakers, and I think with the social science way of thinking overall, is always to think in terms of categories. And as you say, models. Models is a good way of looking at it, because you either look at this model or that model or this model, and you don't see any grey area between it. And you don't see the sort of the fuzzy bits in the process. And everyone has to think in terms of, is it this or is it that? It's a very black and white sort of decision. And I don't think that works. And I mean, even when you're looking at Iran itself, I mean, Iran has always been a very fuzzy area. There's, I always like it when people write, they say Iran is full of contradictions. Well, most countries are. I mean, it's because it doesn't fit your model. But that's because the model is there to help you think about it. It's not there to imprison you. And the trouble is, I think a lot of policymakers and a lot of sort of those who approach things from a political science, and I emphasize that science element to it, I think that they become a bit trapped by their models. And I agree with you. I mean, in that sense, I see this with policymakers everywhere. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they don't have the sort of time that maybe we have. So they're looking at Iran in as part and parcel of a wider thing, and they like to take a comparative approach, and they have a limited time that they want to look at things, and they have to understand it quickly, and therefore the model helps them. And I don't have a problem with that, by the way. I don't have a problem with that as long as you understand that it's a model. It's not something that you.
And what are the inputs into that model?
What are the inputs and what are the outputs? And the inputs are extremely important.
Are they reading Ali Ansari, for example?
Well, exactly. I mean, I would stress that enormously. I mean, I think that sometimes, I'm writing a book now actually about the historical imagination in Iran and history and understanding. And it's a very basic thing. As one of my old tutors always used to say to me, he said, "You're only as good as your sources." All right. And this is the thing, when you look at economists, social scientists, political scientists, others, they like to work with data. Okay. And that's great. Okay. Work with data, but understand that data coming out of an authoritarian state is not necessarily data that you can rely on. Right. I mean, I remember reading, this is an extreme example, by the way, but just to try and to provide a good example of someone saying that Iran was, the 13th largest economy in the world.
Oh, because they do GDP per purchasing power parity. I've come across this line.
But even then, what they were doing was they were using it on the basis of almost the exchange rate, or so. They hadn't calculated it in the right, in they'd calculate in a very particular way. They'd used, figures coming out of Iran without really sort of assessing how they were calculating those figures. It's a bit like saying, Iran has near full employment. And I said, but do you know that in Iran, under the law, if you work an hour a week, that counts as employed? I mean, if you don't know that, you don't know that the figures coming out of the Labour Ministry in Iran say, our employment rate is very... Well, it's not exactly, you have to understand how these things are being concocted. There's a fascination, for instance, in this country and elsewhere with polling, and I've seen polls produced that say, Iranian women love the hijab. We've done a poll in Iran and they all... And I say, how did you get to that? How? And then,
Brought to you by IRID.
I know, do you know what I mean? That's my point. My point is that the data,
Well, what do you think of some of these external polling? Over the past few years, this one company, I think in Sweden, has gotten quite popular. They've done stuff on declining religiosity. They've done stuff on, different opposition movements. Do you find that group? I think it's called Gammon.
Gammon is out of Holland. I think it's
Holland.
No, I think they were set up, I think, principally also because they were very frustrated with some of the more standard polling that the Islamic Republic was coming out with. And I think, they have very interesting things to say. I think with all polling companies, I mean, personally, I find Gammon one of the better ones because I think the way they approach it is slightly more rigorous, right? But I think all polling done in what we would term authoritarian systems has to be seen in that context. I mean, look at the polling that goes on in the United States or Britain or other places. The trouble is we've become addicted to polling in a sense that it's starting to establish the narrative. All polling does, it gives you, exactly as you were saying earlier, a snapshot. That's what it does. It gives you a snapshot. And it also depends on the question you ask, right? Now, I know people who've been critical of Gammon for that very reason. As I said, I'm not expert enough, but it's a salutary reminder that it does depend on the question you ask. And if Gammon asks a certain question and it can get maybe a different result to a similar person asking a slightly different, or a different company asking a slightly different question. So again, I'm not expert enough to sort of say which are better or worse. All I would say is that you cannot use any of these polling. These polling things are often operate in some ways because analysts and policy paper, they want data, they want facts, But as any historian will tell you, facts are what you make them in a sense. You, as a good historian, you select your facts and you work and you build the narrative around your facts. And no fact operates in isolation. It operates in context. Context is everything. So I think these sort of things, when you're looking, I mean, this is what I'm in some ways fascinated about at the moment is exactly your point about inputs. You have reached a conclusion about something. What informed that? And as well as I do, I don't think we need to be shy about it, that if you were to talk to an Iranian in Iran or actually out home and interview them, for instance, they may give you, 2 or 3 different responses to the same question, depending on how long you talk to them and how you phrase the question.
And what their relationship to you is.
Exactly.
And is this online versus over the phone versus in person?
And, what I say to generally those who are, non-Iranian, have no Iranian background, is you're less likely. An Iranian is, first of all, one might say that they are less clear in their own mind about some of the things that they may think. That's true. I mean, if you live in an authoritarian system, you're never going to necessarily tell the truth right to begin with because it might be dangerous for you.
That's one of the most, just footnote on this, I just have to say this, someone who just watching with pain what goes on in the Middle East, particularly, or any authoritarian society, the need to have to engage in white lies every day just to survive has a corrosive, it has a corrosive effect on the soul.
Yes.
I don't mean to get so high and mighty, but the need to have to navigate your way in life through lying is really corrosive.
I mean, for me, very interesting. Hannah Arendt's on totalitarianism is very insightful on these things. And of course, she's talking about the Soviet Union and everything. But I think it applies to Iran. Of course, people are not going to be, if it's your mother or your father or your brother, whatever. Obviously, they know you, Behnam, and they'll say, well, that's fine. But I don't think that your brother is necessarily going to come to me, someone they don't know at all, and immediately open up. Now, less so for an American or a Brit or a French or whatever who says, I've come to interview you about something. What do you think of Mr. Khamenei? And they say, yeah, I think he's great. Well, of course they're going to say, I think he's great. They live there. They don't want to, do you know what I mean? I mean, I've actually seen some polls. I remember one that said that we did a poll on the popularity of the Velat Faqih. I said, how did you do this poll? So we rang them. I said, are you serious? And well, you rang people in Iran and you asked them over the phone what you think of Ali Ansari. What do you think the result would be? Now, again, these things are not zero sum. Sometimes you get some fairly sort of interesting answers. But overall, I would say you need to be very careful about how you approach these things.
Well, moving away from the scientism and back to something you feel much more comfortable and expert in, because by the way, I can't really go much further with polling anyway, in this country or in any other country, which is kind of a title I want to second for your book, which is The Uses and Abuses of History. Khamenei has had only a few post 12-day war speeches. I think like 5 or 6. You can count them on one hand.
I know.
Some were shorter. Most recently, I think we went just under an hour. He's in the first 2 or 3, he was mentioning Iran quite a few times.
Yeah.
These guys don't like the word nation. These guys increasingly have been using the word nation. How does Khamenei fit into this increasing attempt to co-opt nationalism? And then I just want to bring you to, I think, his most recent speech, where I zoomed in on this one thing, being, again, a first-generation Iranian American, where he's actually trying to prevent brain drain, which is something we've seen for generations.
I saw that. Yeah.
What do you make of that? He was basically saying, forever you will be a stranger in a strange land if you migrate. He was basically almost talking about the rising kind of neo hard right nationalism in the West to say that you will never fit in there.
Well, yeah, but I also think he's very late, isn't he? I mean, to the idea that he's going to try and stop the brain drain. I mean, I match it with, Ejei's comment, his minister of, his head of the judiciary, who said at one stage, he said, Iranians should all come out, they have nothing to worry about, he said, as long as they haven't done anything wrong. And then he said, they should take their punishment like a man or a woman or whatever. And that's fine, because, if we, execute you, you're going to go to heaven anyway, because you'll have paid your penance. And I said, that's not the best,
casualness
most attractive. It's not the most attractive incitement for anyone to go back, right? To say that, just take, people have nothing to worry about, because actually, if we decide to punish you for this, that, the other, it's for the good of your own soul, oh, great. That's not exactly what we want. Khamenei has a very, very, simplistic view of history. I mean, he's not a wide reader on history. He does like to read. I mean, I know that
Russian literature.
Yeah, Russian. He does. He also likes a bit of Victor Hugo, and he bragged about it. And also, I know that he's read the Diaries of Nasruddin Shah and this sort of thing. But his understanding of history is very driven by a sort of a certainly an anti-Western, a sort of post-colonial narrative of one sort or another. And he's not very, he's not deep on this stuff. But I saw him recently talking about the constitutional revolution, for instance. And he repeats this guff about, the whole constitution being a British invention. And
his Mashruteh.
Yeah. And it's a standard narrative that they say that Mashruteh is, what actually people wanted was Sharia law, but that Grant Duff, the British charge d'affaires during the Bast, inserted the word T into the word. It became it became Mashruteh or something. I mean, they're absolute nonsense. And, anyone who read the history of the period would know exactly that actually there was a long gestation of political thought and ideas in Iran in the 19th century. And, Fouroughi and his father actually set up, the first school of political science in Iran in 1899. And these ideas were being discussed, albeit in a limited sense, but certainly discussed. And it was clear what people wanted. I think Khamenei has a very, very one-sided, very ideological reading of history, which sort of emanates from what Khomeini did, of course, which is, he wanted to stress the fact that all history, all sound history in Iran is Islamic history. But more than that, it's about the mullahs. Whenever
they were always the vanguard.
They were always the vanguard of freedom and all this, that, and that, which is, it's nonsense, actually.
I want to touch on this Khomeini a bit. I'm working on something, but kind of the ideological origins of these two men. And there's a lot of
Khomeini?
Khomeini and Khamenei. There's obviously, they cut their teeth in the late World War II, early part of the Cold War, so much formed by that kind of the third worldism that you mentioned, but with that Islamist tinge. How much Sayyid Qutb and Brotherhood impact is there, and even on the evolution of Sunni militant Islam onto these guys' thinking? And the reason I'm saying this is there's a lot of stuff on Khamenei and Sayyid Qutb, but on Khomeini, I believe he is the first Shiite cleric in a major speech that I've ever seen, and I've spent not that much time, but I've spent quite a bit of time poring over these old treatises talking about Jerusalem.
Yeah, I mean,
that seems like I don't want to say that he lifted it from
I don't know enough to be honest, about what specifically influenced him. I mean, we do know that he had a fairly, let's say, controversial or relationship with the Fedayeen Islam, with the people who were busy going around assassinating and terrorizing people.
I think like 10 senior figures.
Yeah, and of course it's the Fedayeen Islam who invent this notion of corruption on earth. I don't know if it hadn't occurred to me actually that corruption on earth is not actually it's not
religiously.
It's not religious. Yeah, it's not. It's basically invented in the 1940s to justify killing people. And it seems that who was it? The senior manager at the time, Taleblu was very skeptical of Khomeini's relationship with some. There was an association, and it seems likely that he would have been aware of, obviously, people like Qutb and others. How much he imbued some of that or borrowed that, I wouldn't really be in a position to sort of like comment on, really, to be honest, because I don't know enough about it.
Well, actually, to take that to again. History,
you might know more.
I'm still digging through. I'm going through the literature,
yeah.
But it almost seemed like Khomeini referencing Jerusalem is like a play on Hajj Amin al-Husseini from World War II. There's no clear evidence of that.
We do know,
but I've never seen any real interest by Shiite Marja to talk about the Dome of the Rock.
No,
he's very interesting.
I mean, I think Khomeini, first of all, was a very political mullah in that sense. I think he would have understood the significance of the state of Israel and, Jerusalem or whatever for what he considered to be a wider Islamic cause. There's political mileage in that. So he decided to, take on that. I mean, we forget, of course, that, the other thing I'm sure he would have borrowed into is the sort of the rise in left-wing dissident thought in Iran, certainly post-67. So, remember Jamaluddin, Jalal al-Ahmad, wrote a very flattering account of Israel, when he first went
to the Israeli Republic.
Exactly. And then
I bought
Israel. Yeah,
I have to just share this story. I bought a used copy of that book.
Really?
At my favorite used bookstore on Allenby Street in Tel Aviv.
Oh, really?
And the owner was so happy. He was talking about this book. He's like, no one pays attention to this book because it was actually at the height of the judicial protest. That was when I was last there. And he was saying this should be a warning to Israelis that, some of the theological, political, philosophical founders of the Islamic Republic liked things that they saw in our society. It was a very interesting warning. I think he also may have summarized that from some of the reviews of the book done when it first came out in English in the 80s.
Yeah, it came out. And the thing is, of course, after 67, Al-Ahmad then has he has an addendum to the book where he's sort of much more critical of Israel. But of course, when he first goes, it's like the sort of, this is a socialist heaven. And, but like a lot of left-wing people used to sort of think of the kibbutz and the sort of thing in Israel as a sort of a
model.
A model.
There's the model
word.
Model.
Model. Yeah, absolutely. And, obviously post-67 it turns. And I think clearly, what I found very interesting is that, when the State of Israel was founded, there was hardly any protest in Iran. Nobody was particularly interested. And the Kashani, then the leading, political ayatollah at the time, did try and raise a protest about it and nobody turned up. Basically nobody turned up like nobody turns up now in Iran.
No one gives a damn.
Nobody gives a damn. Yeah, nobody gives two hoots about it at the moment. They're just not interested in it. And I think they've turned it, they try to ride that as a sort of a means of, generating a bit of interest and passion or whatever. And it just, of course, at times it has. Let's not be surprised about it. But interestingly, both in the late 40s, early 50s, and, there's a period, obviously, in the late 60s and 70s when there is growing interest, and certainly in the early period of the Islamic Revolution. But I think now, again, it's died off again.
I want to take that to an extreme conclusion. Not only does it appear not to have died off again, you have all these online Israeli-Iranian friendship societies, the amount of social media integration, the amount of Iranians going to the IDF in Farsi and the Mossad commentary account, and all of this stuff. This really does seem to be a fundamentally different shift in both diaspora and domestic dissident discourse. And also, I think a critical juncture there was, the Crown Prince's visit to Israel in 2023, kind of a taboo-breaking thing. And are we headed towards a period now where part of the dissident and dissenting discourse against the Islamic Republic is not just nationalism, but like this pro-Israelism, like it's come out of the other end? Because certainly the not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life only for Iran stuff has been there pre the conflict.
Yeah, it has.
But now post 12-day war, how does this come out of the wash?
I mean, I think it's interesting because I think, one of the aspects of nationalism in Iran, of course, is it tends to be quite let's say, skeptical of the Arabs. Okay, I mean, traditionally Iranian nationalism has tended to be sort of skeptical of the Arabs and more, in a line with, say, Turkey, Israel, and the non-Arab countries. Now, I have to say, I think in the long term, that's that needs to be resolved too. Iran cannot flourish in the region by being antagonistic with most of its neighbours, right? But I also think that there is a sort of a natural affinity actually with the Israelis and certainly the Iranian Jewish population. And there are many Iranian Jews in Israel. And that sort of level of communication, shall we say, between Israelis and Iranians, I think is striking is reflective of a historical and cultural relationship. I mean, I think Jerusalem is the only city I've seen where there's a Cyrus the Great street. Yeah, I mean, it's and obviously, we talked about Cyrus the Great Day. I've always said there are three countries in the world that really love Cyrus: the United States, Israel, and Iran. And I mean, as I said to someone, what we really need are the Cyrus Accords.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's it.
Amen. Listen up, policymakers.
I know. And, that I certainly think that's the way it's going in Iran. I think people are, again, they're fed up with being told over and over again that, they need to be enemies with Israel. I think there are obviously people that I think it's very natural that have a sympathy for the Palestinians. But, as I tried to explain to my friends, I said the Iranian relationship with the Palestinians is a very mixed one. Yasser Arafat was the first person to visit Khomeini after the revolution. And then the minute Saddam Hussein invaded, he switched sides. I mean, it's not one that...
That's nationalism. That's Arab nationalism.
I know, do you know what I mean? That's not something that the Iranians are terribly keen on. I mean, it doesn't look very good from their point of view. So... there's a sort of there's a view in Iran, not that they don't necessarily care in an emotional sense, but they don't see it as their problem. This is an Arab problem. You go and sort it out with Israel. Why should we get involved in it? Why are we spending all this money? Why we need to focus on our own stuff? And I think, of course, the Israelis, for their part, because there's a large community of Persian speakers and people I think who genuinely like Iran, actually. There's that affinity. So I personally, my view anyway, certainly as we go forward, is that one of the critical turning points, when we get to Hemingway's point about slow and fast, will be when an Iranian state basically decides that it's going to recognize the state of Israel. And I think that will come.
Doesn't that have to come after an Islamic Republic, though?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, let me put it this way. As I said to someone, if the Islamic Republic does that, you'll know the Islamic Republic is dead.
Exactly.
I mean,
It was interesting that Trump added that. I don't know if you saw the summit he had in Sharm el-Sheikh.
He said recognize the state of Israel.
I've never seen the U.S. president.
I think he's absolutely right. No. I mean, this is one thing I do agree with him. I think if you want to establish a wider Middle East peace, it's got to include everyone. Okay? And that means we have to acknowledge Israel. Now, and let's see, I don't know how things will go, but let's say if the Saudis and others reach some sort of settlement in terms of the Abrahamic Accords, Iran will become more and more isolated in this respect. And sooner or later, you have to make some sort of compromise. Now, what the Islamic Republic probably will do in some ways is they'll say, well, we don't recognize the state of Israel, but we're not going to actively work against it. Fine. This goes back to a sort of a Khatami era type thing. But, that at the end of the day will not be enough. It'll be an important step, but it won't be enough. And, as people say, if Iran at the end of the day, in the dire state that it's in, I mean, economically, politically, environmentally, by the way, we haven't mentioned the environment. It's just a complete fiasco. And it requires economic integration into the global economy. Part and parcel of that will have to be some sort of modus vivendi with the state of Israel and settling its scores there. Because most Western countries, and certainly the United States, will not engage with Iran while it's constantly saying we're going to, wipe Israel off the map and bragging about it and this sort of thing. And this is the point with Iran, of course, is that this is what to go back to our original discussion about the sort of vulgar nationalism. It's a completely pointless bragging, about, we're going to do this, we're going to obliterate that, I mean, even the 12-day war, I
have a hard time calling that nationalism. I know. Because it is just, it's their revolutionary Islamist creed. Exactly. It has nothing to do with the nation, clearly nothing to do with 2.5 millennia.
But this is what, I mean, again, I think the important thing, I think you highlight a good point here. We have to define what we mean by it, right? I mean, they would call it, bombastic nationalism. I agree with you. I mean, I think it's complete nonsense. I mean, it doesn't serve the needs of the Iranians, does it? I mean,
they even have issues with the word Islam. One of the favorite articles I wrote here when not having to deal with sanctions and centrifuges and guns and bombs was Khamenei's use of the word American Islam. And contrasting that with Islam and Nab Muhammadi, pure Mohammedan Islam, which actually Mohammedan now is not a good word, but that's what he was using. Even with Islam, these guys want to be parsimonious.
Yeah. He was saying the Saudis have American Islam.
Or if you just believe, but you don't extol the virtues in your public life.
No, I mean, it's to my mind, ideological nonsense that they get out. I think the pity is, to be honest, is there are still people here, abroad, others who sort of take this at face value. I mean, they sort of say, "Oh, well, this is Khamenei." No, I mean, it's gibberish. I mean, we should call out what it is, And I think you're quite right to say. I mean, I don't think it serves the interests of the Iranians at all. But it's a sort of very Orwellian definition of nationalism, which is that, as he says, when he distinguishes between patriotism and nationalism, say two parts of the spectrum, he says nationalism is some sort of vulgar sort of where everyone is subsumed to the nation in a collective way, but the nation is there to basically support a particular relation of domination, the power of the individual.
Sounds like Hobbes' Leviathan, kind
of. Exactly,
but
it's not. I mean, Hobbes' Leviathan is even, I would say, even more
cruder.
No, it's in some ways a more positive thing because than this. I mean, but you're right. I mean, there are elements you're right. I mean, there are elements that overlap, but Hobbes is talking about order and the political order. This is the willful use of cynical use of emotive ideas in order to sustain your power. I don't think you have any particular. I mean, there is nothing. Why is it in the interests of Iranians to be in an endless war with the United States or Israel? What point is it? And I think Iranians now themselves are already saying it. Say why are we in this? What's the point?
You tapped into a word here that is very popular in DC. Endless war.
Yeah, I've heard. I've seen it.
It's being used and abused, I would say. But not that I'm auditioning for any role. I love my job here, but as an Iranian American, you can't help but want a better government and a fundamentally different kind of Iran, and an Iran that really does have a positive foreign policy influence. And to that end, I think it is the job of any Iranian who kind of talks positively about nationalism to try to define what is a positive nationalist foreign policy for the future.
I agree.
And do you see a world in which where traditionally the West fears this Orwellian definition of nationalism from Iran as in irredentist and predatory and hegemonic and imperial? I've tried to walk this very fine line at 13 years at FTD by saying it's not Iranian power we need to be afraid of. It's the means and the ends to which that power is wielded. Is it a fundamentally constructive power or is it a fundamentally destructive power? And I think the revisionist order the Islamic Republic has sought to erect and the status quo order they have sought to destroy really should sharpen the choice for the West to actually, you can't be neutral on a moving train here. You have to lay a claim to Iranian nationalism and, forgive the word again, use that as a shiv against the Islamic Republic. Because a potentially nationalist Iranian foreign policy in the future would not be, in my view, about empire building. If you really want to do well by the nation, that is Iran first. That is make Iran great again. That is Iran come home.
Coin the phrase.
That is end the endless wars. Why do you think policymakers, in particular Americans, why aren't the isolationists right talking about the need for Iran to become isolationist?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you.
Such low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, I agree with you in the sense that, if you go back to the original ideologues of Iranian nationalism like Foroughi Taqizadeh and others, that's exactly, what they talked about was cosmopolitan nationalism. They said, our nationalism is not one that hates the outside world. Our nationalism is basically what we would define as patriotism. It's about building relations with the outside world. As I say to colleagues, so one of the advantages we have now, in a sense, in terms of discussing this, is that I think for the first time in many years, people are now looking at a post-Islamic Republic Iran. Okay, it is now actually on the horizon. Okay, we don't know how far the horizon is, but people actually now, I think in policy circles, and I certainly hope in this country as well as others, are thinking, right, what is the alternative vision? Yeah, what is it? And of course, there are people that sort of say, oh my God, Iran would be a great economic power or whatever. We don't want a strong Iran. But actually, a strong Iran has got to be a good thing if it's a constructive power in the region. A strong and economically strong, sound social base without an irredentist, without an expansionist, but actually as the economic engine of the Middle East. It's got to be a positive thing for the region, for the entire region, that works with partners, that provides a certain amount of a security cordon. These are the sort of things that the Shah in some ways wanted to do. But again, they were led, that people got a little bit too anxious about the power of the state and his affectation and stuff for the military and other things, which obviously people now now really regret that they dissed at the time. But the fact is, had the revolution not happened, and had we gone on in a way, I don't think the Shah was particularly irredent. I don't think he was looking to sort of,
No, the hyper-nationalists critique him about Bahrain.
Exactly. But a sound, stable, strong Iran, which provides almost like a security guard, is like the a sort of Franco-German core of Europe in a sense. Well, Iran and Turkey and they could provide a sort of a security cordon and net, but also with a strong economy that obviously has a consequence for the wider. I mean, if you have a strong economy that produces and consumes and whatever, it's got to be good. It's got to be good for the rest of the region. And I think what we need to understand and articulate, and I agree with you, is a vision of a well-governed, good governance at the heart of it, strong Iran that contributes positively to its region. And what's wrong with that? What is wrong with that? It's got to be good. And the trouble is, we can't imagine this in the current regime, right? I mean, it's such a mess. But why can't we think about it in a post-Islamic Republic? And I think for the first time, because people are thinking about Islamic Republic, and this in some ways is a consequence, we have to say it, of the Israelis having changed the equation over the last 18 months.
Absolutely.
I mean,
there is a possibility.
That's what I mean. I mean, in a sense, what the Israelis have done is, whether you agree or not agree, I'm not getting into those details, but they have said, and what they have done is they've sort of said that there is a different possibilities that are available to us. And I think, that is people will often say, oh, well, we live in a very short term, I have to say, analytical framework, I'm afraid to say, in the West these days. But these things are slow burners, and Iran is a slow burner. But as we've said earlier in this podcast, we can already see changes taking place socially. The social revolution has begun. We're now waiting for the political, consequences of that, and I think it's coming. And when it comes, I hope people in Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, and others will be ready for it, and will be ready for it in a positive way.
One footnote, and then I want to bring our conversation, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, and I only wish we had cigars to rival the Joe Rogan experience. We have a similar backdrop.
Is that what they do? Oh, right. Okay.
I think he has cigars made for him from something. We should get Behnam and Ali brands. Not Cuban,
successful.
Though.
Oh, right.
Respect the embargo.
Dominican, yeah.
Yes. Is one, the power of imagination. These governments, with immense respect to them, are so caught up in the moment, are so caught up, nuclear crisis, missile crisis, drone crisis, regional crisis, water crisis, whatever, that I haven't really seen a lot of strategic thinking from. I hope there are people deep down inside who are, but, the warning from the 9/11 Commission report, every time I hear these Western policymakers talk about Iran, in the back of my head, it's going off, which is to say, we never imagined, it's all about the power of imagination. It says, we never imagined planes could be used as ballistic missiles. And my fear is the very kind of risk-averse, hesitant, skeptical approach towards not having to foster that evolution, but support that evolution, or support that revolution is not there because they haven't bothered to imagine a fundamentally different kind of Iran. All the policies that they are geared to implement is contain, counter, roll back. They haven't had to think once about what does a different economic engine in the region look like? What does a different social engine in the region look like? And that lack of imagination, I fear, even if 99% of your work as a policymaker is small scale, that 1% is preventing you from thinking big.
I think the absence of strategic thought in the West is a very serious problem. I think there are some structural reasons for it. I think there are some intellectual reasons for it. I don't think it's for a want of trying.
And I mean that with immense respect and deference to friends and people I admire in all of these governments.
I mean, I think, and I know Bib, and it's one of the things I argued in Britain quite heavily, that we need to restore, but I'm not the only one. I know, Peter Ricketts, who's an ex, I think, PUS at the Foreign Office. He's also written a book, very long, about, our lack of the absence of strategic thinking. I think it's a problem. And I mean, I remember positing to someone, I said, just imagine if we brought Iran in from the cold. Just imagine if Iran was now had a constructive, I said not pro-Western, just a constructive relationship with the West. Just imagine how many problems would be solved by that if you had a proper, good, constructive relationship with the new Iran. And of course, people sort of say, they sort of struggle to think out that. But I said, but you have to think about this. Because it's a prize worth fighting for, isn't it? Isn't it? I mean, if Iran was outside the Russian orbit, it's not that we're saying it shouldn't have relations with Russia or China, whatever, not so.
Normal.
But normal relations, just think what would help. Think what Afghanistan, Iraq, the Caucasus, Central Asia, the Persian Gulf, whatever. Think about our constructive relationship with a normal country, in inverted commas, whatever, normal, but you know what I mean, non-revolutionary, non-Islamic revolutionary. And of course, I think for the first time in a long time, I think people are now beginning to think about that. But it is true. I think bureaucracies have a tremendous suffocating effect on the ability to think. Again, it's like having models and that constrain us. I think bureaucracies are themselves a form of, the best bureaucracies, I have to say, have means by which, and this is why we have, for instance, in the British Foreign Office, they have the sort of research analysts and stuff like that. They're meant to think outside the box. But the weight of the bureaucracy can sometimes, for them, is even quite daunting. And the direction of travel, I don't know how it works entirely in the US, because I think in terms of foreign policy, the White House has much more of a role than perhaps the State Department. Again, in Britain, Downing Street has a stronger role than perhaps it used to. But nonetheless, there's often a default position which goes back to what you're comfortable with. And what you're comfortable with is what you know. Mm-hmm. And the last thing you want to do is have to sort of think about
change.
Yeah, it's really hard, But, this is why you and I exist, Behnam. I mean, we're there to say to them,
plug for a bright career.
Think about it. I have long felt actually that think tanks have not done that job as well as they should do. Think tanks are precisely there to be, the grit in the system, challenge the consensus, challenge the order.
Not replicate the consensus.
Exactly. And I think, to be honest,
very well put.
Yeah,
very well put. I lied. I said I had only one more question.
Okay.
There's one short one, but there's one major one. The major one is you're ending on an optimistic note, which is really eerie for Middle East conversations. I'm not used to that.
I know,
but you're pointing to light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
But you are a scholar of Iran. You've seen challenge. You've seen change. You've seen this model. I use the word model. You've seen this formula that I've seen elsewhere: evolution, devolution, revolution. I didn't get to ask you yet, as someone who knows so much about Iran, what are you worried about? I don't mean just the day-to-day, but what are you worried about big picture when it comes to Iran, the West, Israel, the people, homeland, the discourse? What is one of your biggest worries?
I worry about the fact that, Iran has become so run down by the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution that, my big worry is that the reconstruction of Iran will take longer than we think. that the damage done to the social, intellectual, but above all to the moral fabric of the country is enormous. And I don't think people have taken it seriously enough. I'm talking about diaspora and others and other Iranians. I think Iranians are very much of a sort of what I call, they have a flick the switch mentality, which is that, everything will be solved when it's fine. All we need is no, this is going to take a lot of patient planning. And, again, the lesson has to be learned from the early ideologues who understood this. Taqizadeh Foroughi, the people who led under the Reza Shah period, Darvad and others. These were methodical, bureaucrats, statesmen and others who understood that this is going to take time. And I think, my big anxiety is really go back to some of the things we've already mentioned, is that people don't think enough about the seriousness of the problem. They get caught up too much in the moment. They want quick fixes, and there aren't any quick fixes. Things will take time. But what we need are people who understand the level of the problem. Let's take the water shortage and the collapse of the water table in Iran. This is not something that's going to be fixed overnight. It needs proper planning, and it needs proper thought. And I think, the danger for me, I suppose, there is that, we've become so short-term in our outlook that, the damage to the as I said, social, political, environmental fabric of the country, moral fabric, is going to be enormously difficult to resolve.
Getting to zero will be so hard.
That's actually a good point.
We're so in the red on
That's
so
right.
many.
Yeah, we just need to get back to level playing field.
And then now, just to end on a
upbeat note,
totally perhaps upbeat, but totally intellectual note, and honestly sharing my nerdiness. Besides your own work, what is one book you would recommend on Iran, or what's one thing you're reading on Iran that either me, very selfishly, or our listeners, very graciously, would be able to pick up and enjoy? What's something else that you like that's out there in the ether that's informing your view?
I read a lot of history from all sorts of wide different sorts.
So it does, not just Iran.
I didn't even talk about Iran. But there are obviously key books that I really enjoy reading, and I go back to and whatever on Iran, which I think are enormously good. There are a number of different authors on Iran that I do like. A lot of them are, I suppose, in some ways quite, the standard sort of but they're very interesting in terms of the arguments and the, I've read stuff by, that I do enjoy, by Abrahamian, of course, by Arjamand, Rahnama, other colleagues of mine who work on different aspects of foreign policy or the internal state or whatever. So those are quite interesting, and I'm always someone, another one that I found very, very interesting is Amonat's book on apocalyptic Shiism. Very interesting.
I think that.
He's unfortunately, people will criticize me because these are all very sort of old hand, how should we say, people who've been working on this for a long time. Shahabi's article, for instance, on paranoid historiography in Iran has been enormously influential on me. I think that's something that I think people should read. There are a lot of very, very interesting articles that are out there. I have to tell you that probably the thing that I've been which is completely at odds, and you will find completely shocking actually, that I've read over the last year, has been the 5-volume history of the 100 Years' War by Jonathan Sumption. So that is probably what I've been reading a lot of, because it's an enormously long publication. But I always like to pick out various bits and pieces on it, and there's some, interesting sort of asides and anecdotes and whatever that come out of it that tell you a lot about history, that tell you a lot about the way, even, particular societies work, and also, the relationship. There's a wonderful vignettes about even the way in which the idea of Persia worked within the medieval imagination. And these are the sort of things that I have a very broad range of things that I look at, and I draw on. So I'm not someone, to be honest, who limits myself obviously to read on Iran. I find some of the stuff written on Iran is, I'm sorry to say, I'll be very sort of like a little bit downbeat on this, but I suppose one of the reflections of the fact that I read some of the old hands on this, maybe I shouldn't call them old hands, of course, but is that I find some of the more recent books on Iran, particularly those that deal with the political science or the politics or the thing, I don't find them as insightful as I think they should be. There are some good histories. I mean, there are some good histories of the Pahlavi period. We've seen some new histories of, the fall of the Shah and others, which I think are very good and very good reads. But for my part, actually, I would always encourage people to look at some of the articles that are written. I think some of the articles are much more insightful.
Spoken like a true academic.
Yeah, because I think they're argumentative. And I think at the end of the day, never read things. My advice to people is don't read things because you think you'll agree with it. Read things that challenge the way you think about it. And if you come away reinforced in your opinion, that's fine. I read a lot of stuff from people often who I don't necessarily like, but I think it's important because it challenges the way I think. So that's the only real advice I would suggest to people. I suppose I should really have plugged someone's book, but I can't think of it at the moment.
Amen.
Apart from my own.
Dr. Ansari, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today's episode on Foreign Policy. I'm Behnam Ben Taleblu, and Cliff May, founder and president, will be back with you next week. Ciao.